As we continue to think about John the Baptist and what we can learn from him about how to avoid some of the mistakes that come with success, we realise that John is dealing with this challenge of status, and he's dealing with it by being prepared, by having a clear understanding of his purpose, but also having a true perspective on himself. And that helps him to deal with the first challenge, and that's his response to the first challenge that we see. But there's a second challenge that we see in this account of John, and it's the challenge of power. John's success has placed him in a position of power. His message has come with an anointing, and as a result, people are looking to him for direction. They're saying, what must we do? And he stands with that temptation of power, of being able to tell people how and what they need to do. And that power over people is something, but when you start to experience success, we have to deal with. We've seen some examples recently of the wrong sense of power over people. The horrific case of Sarah Everard that has seen recently Mr. Cousins sent to prison for the rest of his life. He was somebody who, as a policeman, was placed in a position of power. He had power over people, and he abused that horrifically. And history shows us so often that when people get into a position of power, they abuse that position over people. Now, we might find ourselves in life in a very small position of power. We might just have a small responsibility, be that at work or be that at church. But how do we respond to this challenge of power? John responded by showing a consistency. His consistency was seen in his response to everybody. He had a continuous, consistent response, be that to the tax collectors, to the soldiers, to the crowds, to religious people. And that was that you need to be baptised to show that you've repented. And that consistency of response allowed him to resist this challenge of power. How do we respond to that? And I wonder, do we change our message depending on who we're with? Yeah, I'm sure we would say, oh, of course not. But I wonder whether we're different around people at work to we are around people in our family to we are around people at church. And it's an important distinction to understand that sometimes the style that we take, be that in different settings, might change. How we take a different style to sharing the gospel to somebody at work, to somebody in our family, is different to having the same message. We can be consistent with the message whilst having a different style in how we present that. But the challenge is whether we take different standards to how we respond to different people. John the Baptist had a consistent message, and that message was about fleeing the coming wrath. There was a message about judgment, and John the Baptist invited all people to avoid that by getting right with God. The temptation sometimes is that we want to apply a different standard. Sometimes we want people to get right before we will accept them. There's a saying sometimes that we want to clean our fish before we catch them. You know, drawing on that picture that Jesus called of the disciple Peter to go and be a fisher of men. Often we can set different standards and apply different standards to people, and sometimes we can apply that in the wrong way, but we can apply our standards to people who've not yet responded in faith. How we apply those standards is really important, and an important question of consistency. Do we justify people's bad behaviours? There's all sorts of questions that come out that allow us to challenge how do we respond to this challenge of power. Are we consistent in how we respond? Are we consistent in our, do we show love to people in a consistent way? Do we show an acceptance of people in a consistent way? And do we take a consistent approach regardless of people's, for argument's sake, status in life? Are we the same with somebody who's on the streets to we are to somebody who is the chairman of the board? This challenge of power was a challenge that faced John, And again, we can learn from his response. And the challenge to us today is to consider whether we're consistent in the way that we apply ourselves to different people in different settings.